Tonight, the stunning verdict against former President Donald Trump. A jury finds him liable for sexually abusing and defaming columnist E. Jean Carroll in the 90s. The jury awarding her $5 million in damages. The former president saying he has no idea who Carroll is. Calling the verdict a disgrace after sitting out his own trial in favor of a stunning deposition. Did his lawyer's strategy backfire? The legal and political fallout as the former president runs for re-election. Just breaking, the federal charges against George Santos, the controversial New York congressman facing multiple investigations. A critical meeting on the debt crisis between President Biden and top Hill leaders. Inside the negotiations, the crippling consequences of a default. With millions of jobs, government benefits, and a recession at stake. One family's message to Washington. The massive flow of migrants at the southern border even before the end of Title 42 restrictions just 2 days from now. New guidelines for breast cancer screening, how much earlier, what women need to know. And the remarkable rescue, how an 8-year-old survived in the wilderness for days until a searcher heard his calls for help.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening and welcome. It took less than 3 hours for a New York jury to find former President Donald Trump liable for sexually abusing writer E. Jean Carroll and for defaming her with the nature of his denials. The ex-president ordered to pay Carroll $5 million. The explosive civil case stemming from an encounter between the two in a Tony Manhattan department store back in the 90s, where Carroll said Mr. Trump raped her in a dressing room. Today, the 9-member jury did not find him liable for rape, but concluded he did sexually abuse Ms. Carroll. The Republican presidential candidate did not appear at the trial, but posted on social media today, calling the verdict a disgrace. In her own statement, E. Jean Carroll writing, "Today the world finally knows the truth." Senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett starts our coverage.
Can we have a statement, please?
A resounding win for E. Jean Carroll. A federal jury finding former President Trump sexually abused her and then defamed her by calling her story a lie, awarding her $5 million. The jury swiftly returning their unanimous verdict after fewer than 3 hours of deliberations. In a statement tonight, Carroll saying, "This victory is not just for me, but for every woman who has suffered because she was not believed." The jurors hailing from Manhattan, Westchester County, and the Bronx, 6 men and 3 women, including a security guard, physical therapist, and former janitor, all kept anonymous throughout the trial, a rare move imposed by the judge for their own safety. Over the course of 2 weeks, they heard from Carroll, tearful at times, recounting the attack she says happened more than 20 years ago in a dressing room at Bergdorf Goodman. 2 friends she told at the time, along with 2 other women who've accused Mr. Trump of making unwanted advances, all to show a pattern, all claims he's denied. And tonight, another. Moments after the verdict, Mr. Trump released a statement on Truth Social saying, "I have absolutely no idea who this woman is. This verdict is a disgrace, a continuation of the greatest witch hunt of all time." A denial similar to this one from last fall when the former president blasted Carroll's story as a hoax, a post viewed by millions. The one the jury found today was defamatory.
They make up stories, and then I'm not allowed to speak my mind.
But his attorneys put on no defense case at trial, and Mr. Trump never showed up, instead posting about his travels overseas.
I don't know anything about this woman.
Though jurors did hear from Donald Trump watching this deposition video where he didn't shy away from that now infamous Access Hollywood tape.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the you can do anything. That's what you said, correct?
Well, historically, that's true with stars.
It's true with stars that they can grab women by the
Well, that's what it's. If you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true. Not always, but largely true. Unfortunately or fortunately.
And you consider yourself to be a star?
I think you can say that, yeah.
Mr. Trump's attorney, Joe Tacopina, telling reporters after court today that tape, a possible ground for the forthcoming appeal.
The Access Hollywood tape should not have come into this case. There were things that happened in this case that were beyond the pale.
In his deposition, Mr. Trump also confused a photo of Carroll, who he'd said wasn't his type, for his ex-wife, Marla Maples.
That's Marla, yeah. That's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to?
A striking moment Tacopina never addressed at trial.
And Laura, this case is also breaking rare legal ground.
That's right, Lester. Carol's case is actually among the first to go to trial using a new law that gives survivors of sexual assault a window to file civil suits, even when the statute of limitations has long since passed. Now, many have filed claims under this new law, none, obviously, with a verdict quite like this, Lester.
Laura Jarrett. Laura, thanks very much. For more now, I'm joined by legal analyst Danny Savalas. Danny, let's talk about that deposition for a moment. Clearly wasn't helpful to the former president. Is that an issue for lawyers going forward as he faces potential other legal cases?
Yes, the lesson to be learned is that if you get Trump into a deposition, he might stay on script for a little while, but sooner or later he veers into improv, and improv is bad for him. For example, saying that the plaintiff in this case was not his type had nothing to do with any kind of defense. It only hurt him in the end. And in addition, defending the Access Hollywood tape instead of distancing himself from it also didn't help. All that evidence created by Trump himself, it had nothing to do with the case in chief. It was something that the plaintiff used liberally in her closing argument, and it worked.
All right, Danny Savalas, thank you. Also breaking tonight, New York Congressman George Santos now facing federal criminal charges. Garrett Hake is following this. Garrett, what more do we know?
Well, Lester, we learned tonight that Justice Department prosecutors have charged New York Republican Congressman George Santos with at least one federal crime, according to 3 sources familiar. Now, one of those sources says Santos was just informed that he's being charged today, and the details of this case are still under seal. Now, in December, 2 federal law enforcement sources told NBC News that Santos was under investigation in the Eastern District of New York for possible campaign finance violations, all focused on disclosures and loans that he made to his campaign in 2022. Santos stepped down from his committee assignments earlier this year amid an ethics committee investigation in the House of his campaign and of his acknowledged fabrications about his background. Congressional Republicans, most notably the Speaker of the House, have largely stood by him up until this point. Lester?
Do we know when he'll turn himself in?
Well, Lester, our sources say that's still being negotiated, but could happen as early as tomorrow. Santos would be expected to appear in federal court on Long Island. That's also when these charges would be made public. Now, I should say that Santos' attorney has not responded to NBC's request for comment. Lester?
All right, Garrett, thank you. Now to the high-stakes meeting between President Biden and congressional leaders with just weeks to go before what could be a catastrophic government default. CNBC's Kayla Tausche has late details.
Tonight, a critical meeting in the Oval Office as America barrels toward a potential June default.
We're going to get started. We're going to solve all the world's problems.
President Biden and top congressional leaders in a standoff over spending. House Republicans recently passing a plan to raise the debt limit if Democrats agree to steep spending cuts. The House Speaker after tonight's meeting.
What are the odds of default now after this meeting, and what happens next?
Well, the House made sure we wouldn't have default because we raised the debt limit.
But now you met with the president.
Well, the Senate hasn't done anything. I've tried to. For 97 days, he has said no. I think the only reason we are actually here today is because we passed something.
But late tonight, President Biden rejecting Republican spending cuts, calling for a debt ceiling increase with no strings attached.
I told congressional leaders that I'm prepared to begin a separate discussion about my budget and the spending priorities, but not under the threat of default. I made it clear that we can cut spending and cut the deficit.
The U.S. has maxed out its nearly $32 trillion credit card, and Congress has just 3 weeks to raise the limit. A default, top economists say, would lead to financial disaster, a stock market dive, tanking 401ks, and a spike in job losses. Missing the deadline by a week would cost 1.5 million jobs, soaring to 8 million if the deadlock reaches the fall. In either case, a recession. And some federal spending could be in jeopardy, including here at All Saints Food Pantry in Detroit, which could lose a third of its annual budget.
There could come a point where we don't have any more food to give.
Divine telling us she relies on this food, her family already struggling with high inflation.
The cost of living went up a lot, so it's hard.
A potential default could also put federal benefits for veterans at risk. We met Shannon Galloway, whose husband Chris served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Since he died 14 years ago, the Galloways have relied on payments from the government.
Those benefits literally are how we pay our mortgage, how we pay our utilities, how we pay daily cost of living.
So what would your message be to the leaders in Washington?
This isn't just politics to us. This is our family. This is our daily life.
And Kayla, we're now hearing there will be another meeting this week in Washington.
Lester, President Biden just moments ago called today's meeting productive, and he's invited all 4 leaders back to the White House on Friday. But there's still a lot of work to get done in a very short time frame. Lester?
All right, Kayla, thanks very much. Now to the growing crisis at the southern border, where there is already a massive number of migrants crossing into the U.S., with numbers expected to soar even higher in just 2 days. Gabe Gutierrez is in Brownsville, Texas, for us tonight.
Tonight, with the border restriction known as Title 42 expiring in about 2 days, authorities say the soaring number of migrants they're bracing for is already arriving, including around El Paso, where more people are now sleeping on the streets. The Department of Homeland Security Monday put out this press release announcing a targeted enforcement operation there today. Now, some, like Marianne Castro from Venezuela, worry they'll be deported. I'm so fearful that after all the sacrifices I made with my 3 kids, I'll have to return, she says. But a Border Patrol union, which blames President Biden's policies for the migrant influx, is slamming the administration for announcing the crackdown ahead of time.
You do not give up to criminals where an operation is going to take place before it happens.
Here in Brownsville, Texas, another city that's declared a state of emergency, migrant aid groups are trying to keep up.
Are the resources stretched thin? Yes, because we don't know what the numbers might look like after May 11th.
The community also still reeling after 8 Venezuelan migrants were killed Sunday when a driver plowed into them. One of the survivors, Gabriel Gallardo, lost a leg. My dreams are broken. They're gone, he says, from his hospital bed. His wife with his 2 children begging for help while she's in Colombia, desperate to make it to the U.S. A brutal and confusing journey. These women from Venezuela say they've had trouble using the government app to apply for asylum. Customs and Border Protection says it's expanding appointments due to high demand. You create an account and it kicks you out, she says. The Biden administration insists it is prepared for the end of Title 42. Many local officials here, though, are skeptical. Lester?
All right, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you. In 60 seconds, the new recommendations for breast cancer screening. Top experts say women should get mammograms much earlier. Why they are making the change and what you need to know. That's coming up next. There is major news tonight about women and breast cancer. Government experts now say mammograms should begin much earlier, at age 40. Erin McLaughlin has details.
Tonight, a leading health panel now recommending mammogram screenings for breast cancer begin for women at age 40, a full decade sooner than the panel's previous guidelines. Experts say it's about time.
The science has always been there. That's why many of us have been recommending 40 for years.
So finally, this panel is listening to that science.
Yes.
The draft recommendations come from the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. They say the new guidelines could save 20% more lives across the board for all women, emphasizing the new guidelines are especially important for Black women.
Black women are 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than white women if they get it. They also are more likely to get more aggressive forms of breast cancer.
The panel stopping short of recommending annual mammogram screenings, maintaining that women still screen every 2 years.
Does this recommendation go far enough?
No.
She argues women 40 and over should get screenings every year and says women should start talking with their doctors about risk factors at age 25. Still, experts are hopeful these new recommendations will help send a more consistent message.
The most important thing for women to know is to begin screening at the age of 40 because it just might save your life.
Erin McLaughlin, NBC News.
In a moment, NBC News investigates work contracts of the nation's largest hospital chain. Nurses say they've been a threat to their health and yours. During National Nurses Week, we look tonight at a company that employs 90,000 of them. HCA, America's largest for-profit hospital chain, has been requiring some new nurses to sign contracts they say put them in debt and could risk not only their health, but the patients'. Here's Cynthia McFadden.
Jackie Rum was excited to start her career as a registered nurse at an HCA hospital in California. But soon, she says, her job was making her sick.
Yeah, my hair was falling out. I was losing weight.
I mean, Jackie, you're almost shaking as you're talking about this.
It's like you're a little traumatized. Maybe I wasn't made to be a nurse. Well, In these conditions, I don't think anybody was made to be a nurse.
The conditions she's talking about relate to understaffing, which NBC News has investigated at HCA hospitals in 5 states, where some nurses and doctors say HCA's focus on profits, $5.6 billion last year, can put patients at risk.
The quality of care that we give is not what we want to give.
She says the hospital refused to let her work fewer hours, so after 13 months, she quit. But she had a problem. She'd signed a contract saying if she didn't work 2 years full-time, she'd have to pay back some of the $4,000 they said it cost to train her. Rum believes it wasn't training, but an 11-week orientation, which included basic onboarding, technical instruction, and shadowing an experienced nurse.
We see these contracts as a form of indentured servitude.
Bryn O'Neill is a lawyer and policy specialist at the largest nurses union in the country, with over 220,000 members. Indentured servitude. Does that go too far?
I don't think so, because it's requiring people to work out a term based on debt.
These contracts are sometimes used by hospitals to staff the worst shifts and the sickest patients with the least experienced nurses, according to some of the 1,700 nurses O'Neill's union surveyed. In the past decade, these contracts have been used by a wide range of hospitals, including HCA, which says its training programs are more comprehensive and substantive than any standard job orientation. The other thing HCA and many other hospitals say is there just aren't enough nurses. We're in a nursing shortage.
There are plenty of licensed nurses, but there's a real lack of safe nursing jobs.
In Utah, Bree Fellows also signed an HCA contract. If she quit before 2 years, she'd have to pay back the $10,000 signing bonus they gave her, as well as up to $10,000 in training costs.
Where's the hedgehog?
Fellows, who had 2 kids under 2 at the time, accepted a job on the overnight shift in labor and delivery. But 6 months later, she was pregnant, exhausted, and begging, she says, to work the day shift.
She said, "You're brand new. No, you can't."
Were there some moments while you were doing this job that you just thought, I'm not safe? I'm not safe for these patients. I'm not safe for myself.
Yes. Just like not catching things that I should have, like just staring at the screen at 3 a.m. It's just very scary.
After 11 and a half months, she quit. The hospital sent letters demanding she return her upfront bonus of $10,000 as well as $6,000 to repay her training.
It was very much a slap in the face, like this has to be wrong.
Frightened, she and her husband took out a new credit card and paid the $14,000 the hospital agreed to take.
These contracts are bad for nurses and they're bad for patients. With debt hanging over their head, a nurse has a much harder time speaking out.
HCA now tells us that since we started reporting on these contracts 2 months ago, they've decided not to use them anymore, though they declined to say whether they will enforce the contracts nurses have already signed or reimburse nurses like Bree Fellows. Meanwhile, the federal government is getting involved. The Federal Trade Commission proposed a rule banning contracts like these, which are being used in an increasing number of industries. Lester?
All right, Cynthia, thank you. When we come back, how an 8-year-old boy survived a weekend lost in the wilderness. A young Wisconsin boy is safe and sound tonight after a harrowing weekend lost in the wilds of a Michigan state park. Ann Thompson has his story.
This smile is proof of triumph over potential tragedy. 8-year-old Nante Nimi, found in Michigan's Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, discovered Monday afternoon sheltering under a log.
The subject has been located. It's great work, everybody.
On Saturday, the second grader disappeared while gathering firewood for his family's camp. Searchers focused on a 40-square-mile area in Michigan's largest state park. More than 150 people searched for Nante, one of them a familiar face to the child, 18-year-old Eli Talsma.
And all I see is his little tiny white sweatshirt, and he goes, "Eli?" And I just ran up over to him and I gave him the biggest hug, and I was so relieved once I saw him.
As Talsma carried Nante to safety, he learned while rescuers couldn't see Nante, Nante saw them.
One night he was sleeping and he said a helicopter flew over him and woke him up.
Police say Nante told them he covered himself with branches and leaves to stay warm and ate clean snow to hydrate. He had no food. Nante's mom tonight thanking the rescuers, grateful for their efforts and the smarts of her little boy. Ann Thompson, NBC News.
One tough kid. We're glad he's okay. That's Nightly News for this Tuesday. Thanks for watching. I'm Lester Holt. Please take care of yourself and each other. Good night. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.